Hey everyone! Raw's bad these days, isn't it? SmackDown's doing pretty well. The main event scene there is popping off. You've got Sasha Banks there, you've got Bianca Belair. NXT, still chock full of talent, you know, from all around the indie scene gathered together hungrily in WWE's little grasp. And then, yeah, Raw is just really, really rubbish. I believe at the time of recording, I think I'm right in saying we've had 3 episodes of Monday Night Raw since WrestleMania 37, and each one of them has been absolutely critically panned. I wrote an article about how bad Raw has been recently. I'm not the only person out there in the world of wrestling content creation to comment upon that. Everyone is talking about how bad Raw is. So I thought it would be nice, hopefully, to take a look back at a good Raw, one of the best Raws ever in fact, regarded as one of the best episodes of Monday Night Raw in the entire history of WWE. So hop in my time machine and let's set off for September 22nd, 1997. Come on, this is greatest of. I think that's what I'm going to call the series now. I feel like I've never actually referred to it as that before. Hit the intro, Owen. Now, of course, as per usual, we're going to be breaking down the topic of this video into 5 separate reasons why it's regarded as one of the greatest things of all time. In this case, one of the greatest Raw episodes ever. And usually, when I'm talking about events, to set the scene, I like to make one of the first points like context or build or that sort of thing. That feels a little bit too structured and a little bit too orderly for this sort of time that we're talking about, 97. So instead, point number 1 is going to be the electric energy in that arena. Now, it's no secret that wrestling was quite big in the mid to late 90s, and although we're slightly behind WWE's peak here in 1997, and they were still playing second fiddle to WCW as well, that competition, those Monday Night Wars, had really driven up the excitement of both audiences, even if at the time, yes, WWE or F were in second place. Another reason that could perhaps explain why the energy of this show was so high could possibly be the fact that it was in the Attitude Era, or was it? Let's briefly talk about that. Because of course everybody seems to agree that WrestleMania 17 with Austin and Vince shaking hands in 2001 was the end of the Attitude Era. But of course there's a little bit of a debate over when it started. Some people say that it started at King of the Ring 1996 with Steve Austin winning that tournament and cutting the now legendary 316 promo. That would place this show within the Attitude Era if we're taking that as the starting point. Some people say it started after this show, WrestleMania 14 when Austin beat Shawn Michaels to become WWF champion. And some people, I'm just doing a little bit of a teasy tease right now. Some people say that the Attitude Era started on this very episode of Monday Night Raw, which we'll get to later on in the video, but that would go some way as to explaining why the excitement levels were so high as well. Whether you count it as being within the Attitude Era or not, there's no denying the fact that the energy around this show was palpable. A lot of people might think, well, did this come off the back of a huge pay-per-view? Was it the go-home show to another pay-per-view? No! The next pay-per-view wouldn't be until a couple of weeks later at Bad Blood in Your House, the scene of the now legendary Hell in a Cell match between Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker. It did come after a pay-per-view of sorts. This Raw occurred 2 days after the UK and Canada, I believe, exclusive pay-per-view, one night only in England. So again, that's not a huge show to come off the back of, is it? This show generated a momentum all of its own. I think the only really notable thing that happened at that one night only show was Shawn Michaels beating the British Bulldog for the European title in England. Bad decision, just a really terrible decision. Shawn Michaels at his political worst, probably. And bear in mind as well, when we're thinking about how impressive the energy levels are here, it's even more impressive when you consider that a lot of this card would have wrestled on that show in England and would have flown back in the sort of 2-day window in between. I don't know whether they flew back on the Saturday night or the Sunday, or maybe even the Monday, but probably not. I'm gonna guess they flew back on the Sunday, because who could turn down the opportunity to finish wrestling your show on the Saturday night in England and then head for a big night out on the town in, just check. Oh, Birmingham. Ugh. But I've mentioned the show was generating its own momentum, not through proximity to pay-per-views or big shows or anything like that, but through the storylines that it was telling at the time every week on Monday Night Raw. We had a huge feud between Undertaker and Shawn Michaels, a feud which really fulfilled all of our base desires, which is, you know, watching a cocky little weasel get absolutely destroyed by an undead zombie wizard. We also had the very tense situation between Owen Hart and Stone Cold Steve Austin after, you know, Austin's neck was legitimately broken at SummerSlam just a couple of months prior. We also had Bret Hart as the WWF champion at the time, this really compelling character in my opinion, a bit of a fallen hero, somebody who had once been so great and so universally beloved and now a bitter, angry, slightly older man. And of course there was the whole Canada versus USA dynamic as well. So in short, there was a lot of stuff going on with a lot of big names involved. And I also believe, I think I'm correct in saying that this was the first ever edition of Monday Night Raw to take place in Madison Square Garden. And I don't know if you know anything about New York wrestling fans, but when wrestling's good, they get quite excited for it. I think it's fair to say. So that's one reason that the show is so great, the energy coursing through it at almost all points of the 2-hour runtime. 2 hours, not 3 hours, the 2-hour runtime. But now we get on to point number 2. And that is something that I think Raw doesn't do as much these days. Point number 2 is the fact that in this episode of Raw, WWE 100% catered to the audience's desires. Now, I'll cover pretty much everything that happened on the show throughout the course of this video, but for this point, we're going to focus primarily on just one match. Easily the best match of the entire night, and arguably the only really good match of the entire night. So how can this Raw be one of the best Raws ever if there's only one legitimately great match on it? Well, hopefully I'll explain that in point number 3, but sticking with point number 2 for a second, catering to the audience. This was in New York, as I've mentioned, Madison Square Garden, you know, the Knicks, the Yankees, hot dogs, Biggie Smalls. I'm walked in here, you know. Another thing that's very, very New York and was part of the roster at the time is Mick Foley. New Yorkers love Mick Foley. We all love Mick Foley, but he's a New York boy and they love him especially. And that's exactly what WWE gave the audience at the time. But not Mankind. That would be far too easy. And they didn't give them Dude Love either. They gave them Cactus Jack. And they introduce him in the best way. It's one of the more fondly remembered, I think, Raw segments of all time, probably. You've got the two personas of Mick Foley that existed at that moment, Mankind and Dude Love, appearing together on the Tron, talking about how they're not going to go out and fight Hunter Hearst Helmsley or Triple H. That's who Foley was about to have a match with. But they're like, we're not going out there. We've heard someone else is going to go out there. And then Mankind says, Cactus Jack is back. And then the crowd just goes up. Here he comes out the curtain, throwing weapons and just looking like Cactus Jack. It was Cactus Jack's first appearance in the WWF. And what a way to do it. And also Triple H sells it perfectly, I should mention. And they go on to have what is now a pretty iconic Falls Count Anywhere match, one of the matches that helped really pioneer the no DQ, rough and ready style that WWE would often utilize quite a lot in the Attitude Era. There's a lot of big moments, like Chyna's getting involved. There's a huge finish as well, where Foley, or Cactus Jack, pile drives Triple H through a table, a very unsteady, scary looking table, and the crowd lap it up. They love every second of it. And that's deliberate. That's a deliberate design choice by WWE. How can we pop this MSG crowd so much? We'll give them Cactus Jack and we'll have him destroy Triple H. Let's get a bit negative, because this is YouTube. It's weird to see, isn't it? In the context of Monday Night Raw, it's weird to look back on a Raw and suddenly remember a time when they actually tried to please the crowd. I know that sounds very simple and very negative, but these days, it feels like WWE or the Raw creative team are not really engaged with us, the audience, at all sometimes. Raw these days has felt recently like WWE just moving the pieces where they want to, with very little corroboration of what the audience actually wants. Isn't that crazy when you really think about it? Isn't that outrageous? Why not? Now, as I mentioned, Foley versus Triple H is the best match on the show by a country mile. There's nothing that comes close to it in terms of wrestling, in terms of action. But that doesn't mean that the rest of the show isn't worth watching. Quite the opposite. It's worth watching all of this Raw because of point number 3, which is intense storytelling throughout the card, from the main event all the way down. Again, I just want to focus briefly on modern day Raw by way of contrast before I get into the other things on this show. Doesn't it feel watching modern Raws Like, it drags quite a lot, you know? There's not really an oomph, there's not really an energy there. It really does start to take its toll. Is that because of the 3-hour runtime? Is that because of the recent lack of a live audience? Well, there's certainly factors, 100%, but not 100%, because they're not the only factors, are they? I honestly feel like another big massive reason is just a general lack of ambition and a lack of grit and drive by whoever is in charge of putting Raw together. I mean, there's little segments that are all compartmentalized in their own little boxes, like here's the guest commentary segment that's going to happen, here's the talk show segment, here's the 2 run-ins that lead to a tag match from what was originally a singles match segment. And everything's just so clean and sterilized and ordered, and it just leaves me wondering, where did all the chaos go? And all the volatility and the feeling that this was real and anything could happen. Now, by way of contrast, let's go back to September 97 and see that even the less important things on the card are charged with this incredibly intense energy. There is real intent behind this booking. I mean, there's a match that, to put it bluntly, is not a great match between the Legion of Doom and Farouk and Kama Mustafa of the Nation of Domination. And yeah, it's not a brilliant tag match by any stretch of the imagination, but it ends in pretty explosive fashion. There's a run-in from Ahmed Johnson, it all turns into a big brawl, and Ahmed Johnson's trying his best, but the numbers weigh him down and he's getting beaten down, and then the refs have to come out and pull it all apart. I'm not suggesting that WWE have forgotten how to book a run-in to end a wrestling match. God knows they do that quite a lot. On the other hand, this run-in feels so different to modern day run-ins because the refs have to get in and it's a lot more wild and less ordered, and there's not clean setups for clean spots, which are fine sometimes, but not all of the time. Some of your brawls have to be wild. It just feels so much more important and angry than like anything else in modern Monday Night Raw. Even the main event scene doesn't feel as charged as this. Another example, let's jump all the way to the main event of the show, Bret Hart versus Goldust, in a non-title match, but one that still feels very important because Bret, again, as I've mentioned, is this compelling figure. He's now a heel, he's fallen so far from what he once was, and he's healing it up in this match. He's refusing to let go of submissions, he's flipping off the crowd, everyone's hating on Bret. And then he wins the match and everything explodes because what we had at the time was a very tense title situation. Shawn and Taker were feuding at the time, as I've mentioned, and the winner of their match, the Hell in a Cell match at Bad Blood, would go on to face Bret Hart for the WWF Championship at Survivor Series in Montreal. But as tense as it was behind the scenes in real life, they carried that tension over into the kayfabe stuff as well. So Bret wins, here comes Shawn with the run-in, and they start having a big old brawl, and then everybody jumps in and gets involved. You've got members of DX running out, you've got members of Hart's clan coming out, you've got Jim Neidhart as well, for example, you've got Rick Rude getting involved for DX. Everybody's there, and then here comes The Undertaker to clear house, the missing piece of the puzzle in the main event scene at the time. Taker chokeslams Bret and Shawn and stands tall to end the show. And there's still like 2 weeks until Bad Blood. You've just got this incredible sense of what on earth is going to happen next week. We don't really get that as much these days, do we? I've actually written a little bit of book in here of what would happen basically if this feud was going on in Raw in the year 2021. So if that happened today, we get Shawn and Taker being forced to team together against Bret and an ally, probably like Bulldog or Owen or somebody. And then the pair would argue in the match. Shawn and Taker would be accidentally knocking each other off the apron or giving blind tags and chopping each other hard to tag each other in and all that stuff we see a lot. Then the match would get thrown out for a flimsy reason. DX would help Shawn beat up Taker, and then after the show, Taker would vow revenge in a network exclusive interview. And that's a joke, but I really can't see it going down that way. It just doesn't compare, does it? The old stuff does not compare to the modern day Raw. Even a few years ago, we'd occasionally have a very compelling episode of Raw, but these days, with this recent run since WrestleMania, Raw just isn't capturing the imagination, is it, on a weekly basis? It's not as gritty, it's not as direct, it's not as intense, and it's not as raw. Yep. Professional YouTuber. There's more stuff going on in the show, of course, that I've not yet mentioned. We've got an opening match where Ahmed Johnson beats The Rock as part of an IC title tournament. You've also got another match in that tournament, Owen Hart versus Brian Pillman, and it's this match that we're going to focus on for point number 4. Not because of the match itself, but because it leads on to a historic Raw moment. And that itself is reason number 4 why this Raw is an all-time great episode, because it features a historic turning point, not just in the context of WWE's history, but in the context of the whole Monday Night Wars. Now, first of all, the match itself, Owen Hart versus Brian Pillman. Okay, the storyline leading into this hasn't aged very well. Brian Pillman's got Marlena with him, who he's kind of taken away from Goldust as a kind of a sex slave. It's really aged very, very badly. It was going to pay off though, because there was going to be a wedding angle where Goldust and Marlena were apparently going to renew their wedding vows, but then Marlena was going to betray him and reveal she'd been in on it with Pillman all along, and she hadn't been as oppressed as it had seemed on camera. That would have been a good payoff. It would have made it a bit less distasteful, but tragically, of course, Brian Pillman passed away halfway through the storyline. This match isn't really about that though, because Goldust runs in and disrupts the match and chases Pillman away, but because he hit Owen first, Owen goes through to the next stage of the tournament. Goldust and Pillman are long gone, and Owen cuts a Daniel Bryan-esque, heel Daniel Bryan, jubilant promo about how great he is to have won such a match. Owen Hart was the best. Now, Owen, a few moments before, had made his entrance to this match, flanked by like a fleet of private security that he'd enlisted because he was so scared of Steve Austin coming back for revenge after he had his neck broken by Owen at SummerSlam. That's intense, isn't it? That's Chekhov's revenge. We're just waiting for Austin. And in fact, Austin had shown up earlier on in the show, cutting a promo from within the crowd. That's real. That is Raw. That's Monday Night Raw. Take note, please, WWE. I mean, once you've got fans back, don't have someone cut a promo in the screens and say, I'm such a face because I'm here amongst the Thunderdome. Someone's going to do that. Someone might actually do that. As Owen is cutting this promo after the Pillman match where he's saying, I'm so great, I'm going through to the next round, Austin from behind. Bang! It's Austin. Everyone loses their minds. It's 997. He's on the rise. And yeah, everything kicks off hugely. Austin gets dragged away by the security team. He starts to maybe have a go at some of them. And then Vince McMahon gets in the ring to try and calm him down. Now, this is before the Mr. McMahon character, really. This is when Vince was still quite, still human. He talks to Austin and kind of sympathizes. He goes, you know what, Steve, I understand that you're really frustrated. You're coming off the back of this horrendous injury. We had to take the IC title off you. I think Austin also had a tag title stripped as well, so he's lost 2 belts potentially. And Vince understands all of that, and he's like, Steve, please try and calm down. I know that you're angry, and I know why you're angry, but don't attack these security guys. Don't attack them. It's not their fault. And then we get the iconic moment, Austin's first ever stunner to Vince McMahon. One of many down the line, and it's not the best one that Vince has ever taken. The sell kind of sucks, doesn't it? But that's not the point. It's an iconic moment. Austin nails Vince. It's a big, massive, historic event. Austin gets dragged away in handcuffs. Yes. It just feels so real. I don't know how many times I have to kind of repeat that, because I'm sure you already know it. Now, if you didn't know, well, I'm sure a lot of you definitely will, but if you didn't know, this was a very crucial moment as well in the Monday Night Wars, because it was the start, it was kind of the spark of this Austin-McMahon rivalry. It helped Vince become more of an on-screen character. He was anyway, but it made him more of one. And then that, coupled with the Montreal Screwjob just a couple of months down the line, would create the Mr. McMahon heel character. From there, we'd get the legendary Austin-McMahon feud that would come to define the Attitude Era and win the Monday Night Wars, essentially, for the Fed. So a pretty important moment on this episode of Raw, if we look at it on balance. And finally, reason number 5, man. There's no complicated way of saying this. This episode of Raw was fun. It was fun. That's reason number 5. And you know what? A lot of Raws around this time were fun, weren't they? A lot of Nitros were fun as well. Wrestling was fun around this time. It just so happens that Raw, this particular Raw on September 22nd, was possibly the most intense and historic and eventful of the surrounding Raws of this time in 97. And there's just so much going on, isn't there? There's so many moments and so many big events featuring so many names that have since gone down in wrestling history. You've got Austin stunning Vince. You've got Cactus Jack versus Hunter Hearst Helmsley in that amazing Falls Count Anywhere war. You've got brawls popping off left, right and centre. You've got a compelling, complicated heel champion in the form of Bret Hart. A few months down the line, suddenly Kane's involved, having made his debut at Bad Blood. You've had the Montreal Screwjob. That's shaken absolutely everything up. Shawn Michaels is the most detested man in wrestling. You've got Austin on the rise trying to catch him and take that title, which he eventually does at WrestleMania 14. We are off to the races, and this Raw is a crucial stepping stone along that journey. A very fun one, by the way. Just such an exciting episode. What happened to that sense of fun? Because WWE can, if they really tried, They could still do that today. Not to the same level, wrestling's not as big as it was in the 90s of course, but they could still make the product more enjoyable to watch. Certainly, especially given the past few episodes of Raw. And if you need proof, they're doing it in other parts of the show. Over on SmackDown, Roman Reigns is probably the best heel champion in all of wrestling today, right now. In NXT, they've still got a ludicrously talented roster putting on very good matches on a weekly basis. TakeOvers still largely knock it out of the park, even if it's not quite the glory days of like 4 or 5 years ago. NXT's still definitely worth a watch. It's still booked with intent. There's still an aim there to put on a good wrestling show. A good example is Cole and O'Reilly's feud. That feels like a bit of a throwback to a bygone era with the rawness of it, the realness of it, and the intensity behind it. What's happened to Raw then? What has happened? And can WWE turn it around? Honestly, I think they will struggle to do so quickly, because this has been a problem that isn't just a sudden one that like exploded onto our radar. This has been quite a long time in the making. Raw has been on a decline beyond just, the past few weeks. It's only in the cold light of day after the big WrestleMania come down, the big hangover from WrestleMania, that we kind of are now seeing Raw for what it is. And that's a big shame. But on the positive side, we still have all of these classic episodes of Monday Night Raw from the past to remind ourselves what Raw and what wrestling by extension could again one day perhaps be. And we can go and watch them whenever we want on the WWE Network. Or on Peacock if you're... Does Peacock work yet?